Howard. So glad to be here. And I so appreciated also Delegate Plum's intro into, well, it's a perfect intro for us, his talk about taxes and tying it to human needs, because that was a lot of what our messaging was on the Nuns on the Bus. So this was the 6th Nuns on the Bus tour that Network has done, and Sister Simone was our leadership on this trip. She regrets not being able to be here today. We have a board meeting this weekend, so she had prior commitments and has sent us as her representatives instead. And I loved the comment about sisters and how much they get done. I am a fairly new sister, and Simone refers to me as a puppy, but my hope is that one day I can become a bulldog. So our inspiration, as I'm sure you all are aware, is Catholic social justice. We, in fact, had this quote on the back of our bus, a Pope Francis quote, "A good Catholic meddles in politics." So anyone that told us we shouldn't be out on the road, we just pointed them to the back of our bus and they could eat our dust. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, I'm going to talk more about the messaging on our bus and what we were telling people and how we were getting that out as we went on our trip. But just the logistics were, it was just under a month-long trip, which was longer than most of the other trips that the bus had done. We passed through 21 states, stopped in 21 states. We had 52 different events that we hosted in 41 different cities. And that route was planned basically since it was in advance of the midterm elections, passing through swing districts. And as John mentioned, we started, it wasn't quite Los Angeles, it was actually Santa Monica. This is our bus blessing event where Nancy Pelosi joined us and spoke. And we ended in Mar-a-Lago, which this is a picture of our bus passing in front of Mar-a-Lago. And the idea there was to sort of hold up the contrast of the common good to the pinnacle of economic inequality. And we had 10 nuns on the bus at any given time. 3 of us were Sister Simone, Sister Mary Ellen, and myself from Network. And then we were fully staffed by 6 to 8 people that did communications and all of the logistic work. And the other sisters we rotated in more or less every week. We would get a new batch of sisters, which was really helpful to keep up the energy level. As you can imagine, it got pretty exhausting. This is a photo of the first leg of sisters. This is in the back of the bus. So you can see it was pretty spacious. And we also carried thousands with us to Mar-a-Lago, as John also mentioned, by having people along the route sign their names and any message that they wanted us to take with us on the bus. The goal of our messaging was really, the number one thing we wanted to do was to help educate folks along our route about the Republican Tax Cuts and Job Act from last year. And although it was a nonpartisan campaign, there was no denying that it was a very partisan bill. It passed along partisan lines. It was forced through Congress. It had 0 input from the party across the aisle. So that was the reality of the situation we're dealing with. And we also wanted to connect the tax law, the new tax law, with what we're seeing now about threats to human needs programs and healthcare, to tie those two together in people's minds. And then one of our goals was also to hold elected officials accountable in advance of the election, particularly the Republicans in swing districts who had voted to advance that bill into law. And our basic messaging was we wanted reasonable revenue for responsible programs, getting back to the equation that Delegate Plum was talking about. You know, how much revenue do you need? We all like low taxes, but what's the cost of that? So as far as holding the members accountable went, we tried to get district meetings in all of the different districts that we passed through with lawmakers, particularly, as I mentioned, in the GOP that had passed the law. And we also reached out, our grassroots mobilization team reached out to our connections in their districts to get constituents to join us in those meetings so they could speak to the specific issues for that location. And then we would hold a rally outside of the district offices to either report out on the meeting that we had or to just speak out and say what we would have said had we got in a meeting. And here's just a couple of pictures of, you can see Simone literally holding somebody accountable with her finger right there in front of the bus. We visited 13 different districts over the course of a little less than a month. Most of them we had scheduled meetings. Some of them, like Bacon and Blum, we got surprise meetings because the rallies were big enough to catch their attention. And they decided, well, maybe we do have time to meet with you all after all. So those were very exciting and really demonstrated to their constituents sort of the power, the people power, and the sway that they could have on their representatives. One of the common themes that we heard was representatives not being responsive to their constituents and people having a very, very hard time getting their voices heard by their supposed representatives. In one case, there was even a constituent that met us at the bus with a cardboard cutout of his representative because that was the closest they could get to him. And he was non-responsive. He was a cardboard cutout, so he never answered our questions. These are just a few more pictures of the rallies and the district offices. Just to give you a flavor, that was in O'Fallon, Illinois, when we had our visit there. And the rallies, it was really heartening to see how many people came out. And while we cannot claim causation, it really does give us true delight to see correlation between the outcome of the midterm election and the visits we did. So these 6 districts were flipped. These representatives were not reelected, so they were held accountable for their vote. And then there are a few that are, as of yesterday anyway, were still up in the air. These are also representatives that we had visited. And then one particular one that I thought you all would appreciate. Congratulations. I'm a student. Another message that we wanted to get out to, I think John called it aggressive educating, was our Town Hall for Justice. We did 17 of these over a course of, like I said, just under a month. And these were sort of our evening events that we would host. And the idea was to illustrate to people what the impacts, the relative impacts of the tax bill were, so that they could sort of wrap their heads around it. Everyone had an idea that it was unfair, it benefited the rich, but we really tried to grapple with how can we demonstrate that. So the first part of these programs was the human bar graph, which is something Network has done before. And what it is a way to demonstrate the growth in income inequality over the last 35 years after the Reagan tax cut bill. And then the second part was bringing in the new tax bit law from last year and showing how that compounds the income inequality growth that we have seen. And then we would talk about the threats that we're currently seeing to programs based on the $1.9 trillion projected deficit that's going to result from the tax law, and also looking at the GOP proposed budgets, which are pretty straightforward, what programs they'd like to see cut. And then we would finish these Town Hall for Justice programs with discussion among the groups to talk about sort of the local issues and concerns they were seeing and to brainstorm and be hopeful about what actions can they take to push back on some of the impacts. So I'm just going to give you a taste of what those town halls, it's hard to give that to you without recreating it, but I'm going to do my best. We started out by introducing the quintiles, which is sort of the 20% breakdown of our economy and income earnings by Americans. And what we did was we assigned a character to represent each of those quintiles. And these were not sort of imaginary characters. These were actually people, based on people that we had met along our bus tours, previous bus tours. So these were based on real stories of real people, and each of them had a story that would be shared with the audience about their family composition, their household, their needs, their issues, their stressors, what programs they were leaning on to help them get by. So Eddie was the bottom quintile, and we had a character to represent each of the quintiles. And a sister that was on that leg of the bus would represent one of those characters and sort of play that part for the Town Hall for Justice. And then we also added a sixth character because we hear so much about the top 1%. It was really compelling to show how that portion of the population played into the overall impacts. So what we would do to illustrate this is between 1980 and 2016, we looked at what kind of growth did each of these quintiles on average experience after the trickle-down economic tax law was passed. And what we have done is we assign one step forward that the character can take for each 5% of income growth that they had experienced over that 36 years. So Eddie got 8.25%, so he got to take 1.5 steps forward. And you can see Nikki was, is it still working?
No.
I thought it just went out. I'm not sure what to do about that. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I will just speak up.
Project.
Okay, I'll project. It's good practice. So you can see that Eddie, Nikki, Deanna, even Adelaide.
It just kicked in.
Did it kick in? Oh, okay. There. Oh yeah, it kicked in. Great. So the bottom 80% are relatively grouped, although we still see some disparity in the income growth there. But then when you get to the top 20%, Jonathan here is taking 13 steps forward because his income grew by 65.9%. And then if you look at the top 1%, George, his income grew by over 200%. So he took 41 steps forward. And just to give you an idea how we did this, you can see this is a photo of the sisters. The one in front here, Rochelle Friedman, who some of you might know, she is a lobbyist here in DC. She represented Jonathan, so you can see how far ahead she is from the other lower quintiles. And then George, who was the 1%, he had to wrap around. He couldn't even walk straight at that point, right? So it was a very compelling way to show the audience how these different characters were moving forward or were not. And these are just some more photos of some of the town hall visits that we did. The next thing we wanted to do, because that basically left us at the starting point, right? And the next thing we wanted to do was show how does the tax bill compound those issues. And we couldn't use the percentage growth because it's a new bill, but what we could use was the projected tax returns that the different people based on their incomes would be receiving from the tax law. And we had to kind of do apples to oranges, so we shifted it to taking a step forward for every $100 that character could anticipate in tax return during the year. So Eddie, the lowest quintile, he anticipated $60, so he got to take a half step forward. And now watch how these steps continue to get further and further apart. Deanna, the sort of quintessential middle income, she's going to get $900, which isn't nothing. And I do need to say that all of the characters did have a tax return, but it's the proportionality here that is really so key. And when you look at Adelaide, she got $1,700 back, took 17 steps forward. Jonathan's taking 76 steps forward. He is the top 20%. And then this is where it's just shameful. When you look at the top 1%, $193,000. George could not finish taking his steps before the program ended. He just continued, Simone would check in, how many steps are you at? How many steps are you at? And he just continued circling the room. And then we also brought in the corporation as a very nefarious character with a full costume, because corporations are people too, right? So that sister always had a good time. And we know that the tax law was really based on corporate taxation changes. That was the goal of it. So the corporation and its profile anticipated a $4 billion return for the year. So we just sent them off walking. And then we also would bring in what kinds of programs we're looking on the chopping block right now, and would have the characters step backwards for all of the programs that they or their children or family members depended on. And what we found was that on an individual basis, the characters on the bottom 3 quintiles always ended up far behind where they started out, even in 2016, much less in 1980. And then we would also bring in just the general things that our government pays for, that we are looking at not having enough money to fund if this tax law stays in effect. Things like infrastructure, education, disaster recovery, which is going to become an increasingly big issue, and environmental protections. So the feedback that we got on these Town Hall for Justice tours were very impactful. People seem to appreciate and be compelled by having things illustrated to them in that way. And now I am going to pass on to Mary Ellen to talk about sort of what we learned. That was what we tried to teach. Now she's going to talk about what we learned and what the response and observations over the months were.